Hello, everyone. I'd like to open by thanking you all for attending this webinar on aligning degree outcomes to the DQP. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laurel Hunter, the Grant Project Manager for the ACC-JC Degree Qualifications Profile Project, and I'll be serving as your host today. And Shane Piccinini, our project coordinator, is also here today to assist with the webinar and provide technical support. Thank you, Shane. I'd like to extend a welcome to the participants of the ACC-JC Degree Qualifications Profile Project and to others across the country who may be participating live or later through the archived version. And we also want to give a thanks to the folks at NILOA for hosting this webinar and also for all the work they do as they continue to support sharing of good practices and new ideas in the areas of student learning outcomes assessment and working with the DQP. I think many of you have visited their website and benefited from the great resources there. I'd also like to thank our contributors for joining us for this webinar. Today you'll be hearing from Paul Gaston, who's one of our 4 authors of the Degree Qualifications Profile. Paul has worked extensively in defining what academic degrees mean in terms of learning outcomes. He's worked with more than 50 colleges and universities as they've adapted to the DQP, and he's the author of a number of books, including his most recent Higher Education Accreditation, How It's Changing, Why It Must, coming out in October of 2013. He's a trustees professor at Kent State University, where he teaches seminars in English literature and higher education administration. You'll also be hearing from Natasha Jankowski. Natasha is the Assistant Director and Research Analyst for the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. Her main research interests include assessment and evaluation, organization evidence use, and evidence-based storytelling. And she holds a PhD in higher education from Illinois State University and has worked extensively studying community colleges and public policy. We're also being joined by Krista Johns, who is the Vice President of Policy and Research at the ACC-JC. She's worked in faculty and administrator positions in her former institutions, including VP of Instruction at Berkeley City College and Dean of English and Business at Diablo Valley College. She's our DQP executive for the Degree Qualifications Profile Project here at the ACC-JC, and she's got some great information to share with you regarding your projects today. The purpose of this webinar is to briefly set the context of our work and to reiterate it for those of you who are actively working on projects, and to introduce our concepts to our tuning cohort and others who are joining in on the DQP trainings for the first time. In addition, we'll be sharing some information and findings on SLO implementation at community colleges in the Western region. And we'll also be discussing the degree qualifications profile and going into some depth about what aligning degree outcomes to the DQP entails. We'll be discussing some methods and variations of approach to alignment at the community college level, and we'll be responding to questions that have arisen in relation to specific areas of learning, especially around the DQP. You should all be able to see a chat box on your screen. We're set up for you to type in your comments and questions as they arise, and we'll attempt to respond to them as we go along as time permits. In the event we don't get to your question, we'll be posting links to this webinar and a summary page of questions and answers on our DQP website. And you can also call or email us with any questions you may have after the webinar. For those of you who are new to our work or sitting in to gain some insight into what we're doing, the DQPP is a project of the ACC-JC, and it's funded by Lumina Foundation. We currently have 16 colleges participating in the project, and project teams have attended an opening conference and have refined their project plans, all of which include using the DQP as a framework to align student outcomes. The plans will get fully underway this fall with an anticipated conclusion by the end of 2014, with some colleges continuing to work past that time, finalizing projects with their curriculum committees or college approvals, or publishing related informational materials and college catalogs and those kinds of things. Projects are separated into 2 cohorts. the associate degree cohort with participants working with individual college projects, and the tuning cohort, a group that is working on cross-institution collaborations on identified transfer degrees. So this summarizes what we're doing, and this slide serves as a reminder of why. We do this for the students. The DQP is a framework that begins with the end in mind, student learning. While DQPP college projects vary, and there are a lot of opinions out there about student learning, there's one thing we believe each of our participating colleges knows and agrees, and that's that a student may be at our colleges for a semester or perhaps a few years. Whatever the case for that student and many others just like them whose entire experience in our institution will be concluded in short order, we cannot let multiple year discussions satisfy our sense of needed quality improvement. And so, as DQP participants, we begin our work with the objective of enhanced outcomes and preparation for our students at the forefront of our thinking, and we go forward with a sense of practicality and urgency for our students. This webinar is the first in what we will hope will be a series of regular programs providing you with information and support as you proceed. We welcome you to send us all your questions and topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars, and you can email those to us at any time. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone who's participating in this project and this webinar. I believe in the work we're doing here, and with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Krista Johns.
Thank you, Laurel. We sure hope that the information presented today will spark ideas across the listeners and become fodder for discussions back at the campuses about the degree qualifications profile projects and about student learning in general. We start with a description of ways in which the heightened public focus on student learning is showing itself. If you look at this quote, you'll see that the value of a degree is one of those areas in which we're hearing a lot of chatter. And in the national political dialogue, value is something like a formula. It's supposed to be equal to the quality of the education over the cost. And of course, both of those are variable factors, and the definitions are being bandied about. But one thing we know is it's a very real discussion. Most of us on the webinar know about the President's call for a rating system for higher education. This is coming, folks, and we need to be ready for it. The next quote I have there from Michael Offerman talks about metrics that are available now and might find themselves in formulations about what the value of a degree is. You see things like student loan and default repayment rates, student progression, completion, what are college operating costs per degree, employment rates, and student learning outcomes. But what we also know is that it isn't easy to use the data that we have now related to student learning. And of course, for us in higher education, student learning is at the crux of the value proposition. Yes, we have standardized tests which can give us some information, but not everything we want. We can get self-reported data from students in student engagement surveys. Again, those are not adequate in and of themselves. It really falls to us to get together and find ways for measuring and reporting student learning in a scalable way, a way that addresses this national discussion. Let's just look at this slide here for a second. You'll notice there's no mention here, and I haven't seen it mentioned in any of the discussions around value of the degree, about courses or seat time. This is not mentioned. We don't see what is filling our college catalogs, what are so painstakingly recorded on transcripts. It really isn't there in this conversation. And you can't get past the value of a degree too far without looking at the completion agenda. There are actually several completion agendas, all slightly different. The Lumina Foundation statement is the one we hear most commonly. It's to increase the proportion of Americans with high-quality degrees, certificates, and other credentials to 60% by 2025. You know, there are lots of compartments and pieces of this discussion as well, but we're realizing that student mobility is a significant factor and has to be looked at. If you look on the screen and notice that we're finding from the National Student Clearinghouse's recent report that in any given year, a fourth of the students who are in our schools will have been at a different school the previous fall. That's a pretty striking number. And the research looked at 1.8 million students, full-time, part-time, across institutions, and this was fairly consistent across all students. A third of all students will change institutions at some time before they earn a degree. Again, mobility is a big piece. Now, I think the next bullet is some good news, that about 60% of students who do transfer from a community college will complete at least a bachelor's degree within 4 years. The zinger is the next piece. For students who transfer out of a community college with an AA degree, that number jumps to over 71%. If you want to talk about a value proposition, that's got to be there. And while this is generally pretty fantastic news, our member institutions need to take note. The 2013-14 Almanac of Facts that the Chronicle of Higher Education puts out says that about 2.6 million undergraduate enrollments are in our region, and that represents about 13.5% of the nation's total undergraduate enrollment. Again, in our region, 55% of those are in the community colleges. What should hit us hard, though, is that those numbers only account for 10% of the AA degrees across our nation. And so we're about 22,000 AA degrees off in our region from what we expect at the current rates. And that's before we even talk about ways to increase AA degrees. Well, our favorite words, transparency and accessibility of information, are right there in the national conversation. We can feel a little bit of a discomfort sometimes with these terms because it's easy to pick up some kind of a political or public distrust or some kind of a debate about whether we're doing our jobs in higher education. But really, people are just trying to get behind what we are saying when we list courses and describe them. What's behind the environment, the classroom, the textbook, the content? What do students get out of this? And, you know, it's the new world in which we operate. We have to be able to take this opportunity to show and inform others about our processes and what we're doing. Let's look at some of these terms and these phrases in terms of driving the call for transparency and accessibility. Student choice is a big one. Also improving our own practices in accordance with the judgments being placed by those external. I don't know about you, but this idea of inserting market forces into college going is an interesting one, and we're not familiar with that as much in the public sector. But in the end, it's really about bringing others to the decision table. And then, of course, we're looking at alternative pathways to credentials. Each of these kinds of things could be a seminar in and of themselves. But let's suffice it to say that a lot of these interesting concepts have come out of the private sector and are new ways to go about credentialing. I would say the innovation that's involved reflects a public perception to some degree of our need for a little bit more flexibility in what we're doing in higher education. And we are exhibiting our own flexibility and creativity, but there's that drive from the market asking us to go further. And it isn't that higher education is sitting idly by. Look, in Hawaii, we have performance funding in existence now, with 3% of the budget for our community colleges being based on a combination of student success factors and enrollment targets. In California, we have the newly rolled out Success Card, and that's a combo of looking at college demographics as well as completion and persistence levels. So we have a number of things that are really driving and showing this emphasis on student learning. Even in the traditional areas of transfer and assignment of credit, we're trying to get more and more agreement about guaranteed transfer articulation patterns, so community colleges can transfer to other public institutions. Things are on the move in this area around student learning. Just to bring out the point that direct assessment of learning has some good pieces for us to look at. Direct assessment of learning is not really at a level or a scale yet to really be disruptive in higher education, but neither was online learning, distance education only 10 years ago. I like some of these ideas, but what will we make of having a time frame for completion maybe ranging from 1 semester to several years? And what do we think about having 100% mastery of all learning competencies required of degree completers? Interesting for us in the traditional classroom environment. And with that, Paul and Natasha, I wonder what you think and what you're seeing out there in terms of this public call and attention to student learning.
Natasha, after you.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Well, I think you've really covered the board rather well, Krista, and appreciate that overview. There are so many options that are available to students and educational opportunities, providers. It's increasingly growing, and it's more difficult for students to navigate and sort of find a way to put the variety of pieces of an educational experience together into a meaningful whole. And I think it's a great opportunity for student learning outcomes assessment to really provide a way to think meaningfully about all these different educational experiences and how they fit together in terms of competencies or educational goals, and really providing a mechanism that can benefit students to help them figure out how to navigate or find pathways, whether it's transfer or whether it's going back and completing a degree, but really moving from kind of a checklist approach to education to something that can be potentially more beneficial and meaningful for students as it's increasingly difficult for educational providers. It's also that way for students. And so I think that's all I would add to those pieces. Paul?
Yeah, I would say that higher education has really always been about competency-based education, but it's taken us a long time to really affirm that and to thrive on that. When I was working with online education back in the 90s, what I liked about it most was that it suggested good practices for anyone's classroom, even the most traditional, because with online education, or certainly with competency-based education, teaching and learning have to be very intentional. What is to be achieved needs to be very clear from the start. The structure by which you obtain what you're achieving needs to be very clear, and there really does have to be a kind of sharing between the instructor and the student in terms of building learning together. And so I'm not alarmed by any of the headlines of the week, MOOCs this week and competency-based another, because I think it really is about the essential value of what we're doing, just cast in a somewhat more conspicuous form.
Good point, Paul. Well, in the midst of all this more visible emphasis and public discussion of student learning and achievement, colleges have been quietly engaging in student learning outcomes development and assessment for years. And practices in SLO assessment vary, but have some commonalities. Here in our region, 10 years after adoption of a stronger emphasis on student learning in our accreditation standards, colleges were asked to report on their status of SLO implementation. All of the colleges did submit reports, half in fall of 2012 and half in spring of 2013. The reports dealt with 7 areas, and for each of those, colleges had a word limit of 250 words. I think the word limit may have been more, brought more consternation than actually the questions themselves. But there was also quantitative information sought, similar to what colleges report on an annual basis and have been doing so for 7, 8 years. We are going to have this report easy for you to find on our DQPP.org webpage and some other connected resources from the Accrediting Commission, ACCJC. But let's look at what we learned. In our region, all accredited community colleges are active with student learning outcomes, and this is quite remarkable. If you look at how they're doing in terms of ongoing assessment, 2/3 of our member institutions have ongoing assessment in 75% or more of programs, and half of our member institutions are having ongoing assessment in virtually all of their programs. When it comes to the institutional learning outcomes, more than 85% of our institutions have assessment ongoing for those areas and those learning outcomes. The results are being used in a lot of different ways, and this is just a very short list, but SLO assessment is definitely being used for redistribution of college resources. Coming out of planning and using that data, colleges are allocating resources in ways that will enhance student learning. One of those ways is in the area of developmental education, where staff assignments are actually being changed to allow more one-on-one student teaching time, for example. Of course, we expect to see changes in teaching methodologies, of course, and course delivery program requirements out of student learning outcome assessment. But we're seeing it really in some interesting ways. Course sequencing patterns are much more common and discussed routinely now than they were in times past. Some programs are doing things like they're having students generate the content for the course out of the classroom through online methods, reading, other ways, and then in the classroom they're doing what was traditionally considered homework, where they're working through the application and the projects that get them to really reinforce that learning. Colleges reported with great enthusiasm about the dialogue that's happening at their colleges and how continuous improvement for student learning is on the lips of everyone on the campus. The assessments are being used to demonstrate increased student engagement, the connections between in-class work and student organizations, student government in terms of ultimate student learning are being much more closely demonstrated and recorded. And really, colleges talk about every employee understanding they have a role in student success, that college committees, governance groups, in addition to all of the usual kinds of committee work and things that go on, are discussing student success and are revisiting that important part of a college's activity. Student services are being redesigned, and student success is being part of how those designs and redesigns are happening. We do have some challenges. We did find that about 20% of colleges are really not engaged in ongoing assessment of courses or programs. They may have identified outcomes, but the assessment of progress towards those outcomes is not there. And over 10% of colleges don't really look at institutional learning outcomes either. You know, the limited implementation hampers college-wide dialogue and focus on student learning and achievement. And it really also hinders planning and resource allocation decisions across the campus in terms of support for student learning. So the impact of these challenges is strong on the colleges involved. And of course, This delays the ability for measurement and tracking by departments and disciplines over time of how students are doing as they look at student learning outcomes. There were two consistent issues we wanted to bring to your attention, though, and they seem to be appropriate for today's conversation. The first one had to do with the work colleges did to align outcomes from the course to the program to the institutional level. It turns out that those things don't necessarily correlate with better overall performance in student learning outcomes assessment. And of course, there have been a number of different causes cited. For some, though, there was acknowledgement that that alignment process was sort of a paper exercise. It was mostly done to track assessment activities, and it wasn't really done to glean programmatic insights and changes. For others, you know, student learning outcomes development started at the course level, and they were based on existing courses with content already taught. And so the alignment is, in a sense, a compounding of being wed to the existing curriculum and instruction rather than a way of kind of realigning and looking at the curriculum anew. So that is a challenge for us. The second one, being about student awareness and student decision-making from SLOs, is another one that we could have predicted, let's say. You know, sure, for some colleges, the SLO work in the first place was begun only for the viewing of the instructors and departments involved. And so information about SLOs was not shared across the campus. It didn't really become part of college-wide planning. And so taking it to the next level with students was even less likely to happen. But for many of the college, it's really about figuring out what and how to communicate SLO-related information to multiple audiences. And that is tough, having this information available for students, for transfer institutions, for employers, and also for the faculty and members of a department who are supporting a particular degree. So, Natasha, I will pose this question for you. Do you have observations about how the SLO implementation and challenges we're seeing here might compare with what you've seen on a national scale?
Yes, it's actually very, very similar for a lot of institutions. Over 2/3 of institutions have institution-wide learning outcomes, and a lot of institutions are in the process of assessing and have been gathering data, but few institutions are moving into the actual use. And so that's sort of an ongoing challenge of what data on students is actually beneficial and meaningful and can be useful in a variety of different ways within the institution and at different levels, whether it's student affairs or it's classroom-based or programmatic, and really kind of trying to figure out the evidence that's needed to inform and make decisions. So I think part of this is seen as institutions might have started involving themselves in SLO because of accreditation or something along those lines, but it really becomes sustainable when they start to get into continuous improvement. And that's where it becomes a bit more difficult to really find kind of what data is being collected, where's it going, what makes sense for which group. And I just want to echo the point of really having everyone involved in the process as opposed to having it just kind of be the purview of one department or one area. Alignment is difficult. That remains an area where institutions are struggling as institutions move sort of from assessing externally or at the end of a program, so kind of at one touch point, did the students get it, to more of an internal ongoing assessment process of tweaking as they're moving and shifting focus and making changes along the way. It's a very different kind of structure and mindset for assessment. And so as institutions think about that, as well as how to communicate that process to a variety of audiences and be transparent with what they're doing and why, it's somewhat increasingly difficult. We are getting better, I think, nationally at doing assessment, but we're still struggling with telling different audiences what we're doing. or tracking how we're using it and what sort of changes we make. There's a lot of institutions that will make changes but don't have mechanisms or processes in place to sort of track that change over time to see if it actually leads to an improvement in student learning. So I think what you're seeing from what you presented is very similar to the national scene in that regard.
I would follow up just with a comment building on what Natasha has said. I think one of the issues for many institutions is being very clear about what the priorities of assessment are. And if you're trying to use assessment for budgetary redistribution, it can be very difficult indeed then to turn around and use assessment for program improvement. So being very clear about what the priorities are, I think, can be very helpful. There's an institution that I think does a very good job of this, and that's Kansas State, which right at the outset says the point of our assessment is to enable your program, your department, to become stronger. And so we're going to complete the quality circle, but we're not going to use the information in a way that holds your department up to the judgment of others or that ranks your department or your program. And so it's very clear throughout the commitment to assessment where the real priorities lie. Doesn't mean you don't have to also do assessment for the other purposes, but it can mean that you need to separate the processes and make sure that the intent is communicated to everyone involved.
I like that you brought that up, Paul, because we did find in these reports that there were colleges who, in the continuous quality mode, had activities going on all the time related to course and program improvement, and that was really for the department's work and the faculty's work on an ongoing basis. And yet within the cycle of college-wide planning, let's say program review and then strategic planning, the colleges would bring in student learning related data so as to inform resource allocation to enhance student learning.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yes, they're both legitimate, but it's just very difficult to do them at the same time.
I think you're right about that. And if you look at the DQP, which we're about to, we think that exploring the DQP is a way for us to revisit some of these issues that we've talked about. The alignment of outcomes, looking at ways to enhance student experiences and pathways, getting greater levels of program completion, and of course, importantly, supporting innovation in the classroom and in programs. When the degree qualification profile was developed, and let's remember that it was only published in 2011. It hasn't been around a whole long time, but it's just caught on so quickly. There was a thought that given this high emphasis on learning, and given that higher education has been working in the area of learning for decades and even centuries, there should have been a thing that we could be discovering that would describe learning and could become as ubiquitous for learning as course outlines are for catalogs and course descriptions are in transcripts. And so it was one of several strategies that were being undertaken on a national level. Other groups were working on what is a liberal education. Some were working on how does a whole discipline across the nation really understand itself as a group of competencies. But this was specifically designed to be a framework to help understand the value of a degree from the student learning perspective. And there was a very intentional focus on learning as opposed to some of the traditional identifiers we find in course outlines and course descriptions. It also was a means to say, can we in higher education have a shared way of showing this so that it becomes scalable on a level where those from the outside asking these questions can see this and benefit from what is being developed. If you just want to know how this came about or what it looks like, obviously we encourage you to look at your copies of the DQP. If you don't have one, contact us. We'll send one to you. You can also access it online, and we have the link for you. But we learned that how we describe courses for degrees didn't work as well if it was just a running list. It helped to organize things. And the same with the degree learning outcomes. Not to just have a running list of many SLOs, but to organize it in a way that informed curriculum planning and instruction and that others could understand more easily. And so this DQP, the Degree Qualifications Profile, identifies 5 categories of learning and outcomes within those 5 categories of learning. And then those pieces of learning are grouped for associate, bachelor's, and master's degree level achievement. Just to say that at the associate level, across the 5 areas of learning, there are about 20 outcomes. So it's not a huge list, but there are about 20 outcomes that are involved. The outcomes aren't detailed for specific disciplines. You know, what does the vocabulary of this discipline look like? Or what differing perspectives across several disciplines are the most illustrative of our discipline? Those are the kinds of conversations that would happen actually within this alignment process. You know, I've heard a number of people at conferences say, but when you look at the DQP, it's so simple. Well, if it has a feeling of familiarity, it really should. The authors used a detailed literature and practice review for what was available in the field in designing and developing this profile. And the simplicity doesn't take away from the power it has to really encourage deep work by higher education professionals in understanding what their own degrees mean. So I like to call the 5 categories really, and Paul, I'm sorry, you're one of the authors, but I call it the 5+1. And that has a certain ring to it. In those 5, there are 2 types of knowledge, specialized and broad integrative knowledge. When you look at specialized knowledge, you're looking at a depth of study to the degree permitted in an AA degree program that will let students learn how to and to actually achieve mastery in some areas. Now, the specialized area of study might be something specific like the discipline of psychology, or it might be an area like the area of social sciences. Or maybe it could be art history, or perhaps instead it would be arts and sciences. The critical piece is the teaching and learning of how to achieve mastery and how students gain the skills and the competencies they are going to need to continue to master areas of competency throughout college and through their career. When you look at broad integrative knowledge, it's the kind of knowledge that a lot of us associate with liberal studies. And it helps provide students with a learning about relationships between fields. It's helping students see how things fit together and how different fields really help understand the world. It could come, this broad integrative knowledge could come from general education courses, but a lot of the discipline courses also require this kind of learning.
I might just comment briefly that I don't want to break into your categories, but just to point out that all of these categories really express 2 very profound recognitions. And one is the oldest pedagogical principle in the books, which is that students who understand what it is they're supposed to learn far more effectively. And the other is that higher education needs to be able to articulate to the public what it is that we do. We have a strong self-interest in being able to explain what we do, why we do it, what the results are, so that we are not handed that information by those who might have ulterior motives. It is in part, I think, a highly principled, highly positive effort. It is in part an effort to disarm those who might do us harm.
And these categories ring true for us. We may quibble over whether something goes in one category over another, but there's some utility in looking at the types of learning as well as the kinds of outcomes to really understand this so that we can communicate it outside. If you look at this screen, the intellectual skills, you'll notice that the list here looks a lot like the institutional learning outcomes found at our member institutions. Most disciplines do call upon one or more of these in a way particular to their method. Quantitative fluency in a math program might have a very particular meaning, for example. But this category envisions a broader treatment of this as a range of skills that provide that base of competency vital to all the other kinds of learning. And then we go to applied learning. And I have to say here that these categories of learning aren't really about teaching methodology. So we're not saying with applied learning that your degree should involve some kind of teaching or course delivery that involves application activities. Of course, that's a great idea, but what we're talking here is about the learning students achieve in how to apply from the abstract to the real world, or how to take from experience and generalize principles for future use. These now, any given degree may have an emphasis in more or one of these areas of learning, but for all students, each of these kinds of learning is important. And
I was just going to add that this was a priority of Carol Schneider, who's president of AAC&U, and it reinforces what you said, that application of learning is not simply a way by which a student confirms or demonstrates learning. It is the means by which a student extends learning and is a vital part of the educational process in all disciplines. And for that reason, there was a very deliberate decision to isolate applied learning as one of the discrete areas within the DQP as one of the 5 categories.
It makes a lot of sense, and especially for continuous learning throughout one's lifetime. That applicability and the skills involved are going to be so essential. There's another category that the authors added, dealing with civic learning. And a lot of times this category is associated with social justice or political awareness kinds of programs, because those are the ones which have really jumped ahead in the area of civic learning. But this is a little bit more basic yet, and it deals with a student's ability as a member of civic society. It's a student's ability to understand him or herself in relation to others is a key part of intellectual development.
15.
And especially in moral and ethical development of students. And so civic education, civic learning as a category of learning and knowledge is a critical part of the DQP.
And just a sneak preview for DQP 2.0 that will be issued sometime next year, that category is probably going to expand just a bit, and we'll read civic learning and global competency, because the civitas, the citizenship for a 21st century student, is really not limited by the city or the state or even the country, but is in part a global citizenship.
So now we get to a fun part, which is the sixth category, the 5+1, and it's a specific institution-related emphasis, something that's unique or uniquely important to a particular college that all degree earners at that institution will attain. In our own membership, in our region, we have colleges whose students, for example, are prepared to remain in their local community and to contribute their abilities there. We have students at another institution that are classically trained out in the desert with the expectation that superior ability and generous purpose will be found in their professional pursuits. We have another college where students are asked to eschew their trappings of status and worldly possessions and dedicate themselves to serving the basic needs of humanity while proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. And we have another college where students are prepared to enter the working world as entrepreneurs, living up to their greatest potential as contributors in the global market. You can see how these expectations of all degree earners at an institution could hearken to the need for a possible sixth category of learning that would be visible within student learning outcomes. So, Paul, you touched on this a little bit already, but why the DQP? Why use that as a way to embark upon this conversation?
Well, I think one reason is that the DQP assumes a number of other conversations, and part of the intent from the very beginning was to recognize, to understand, and draw together on a platform of shared interest, of consensus, these different conversations, making the assumption that nothing is more important for higher educators than student success. And probably second in line to that is being able to tell the story of higher education in ways that are persuasive to those who support us and those who criticize us. But I think the DQP, and this is something that the Council of Independent Colleges project brought out, the DQP is also a useful platform for members of an institution to use to speak to one another. It is, for some institutions, the first such platform in many years, a way of bringing together people who share concerns but rarely have shared conversations. And so I think that all of those considerations taken together suggest at least some of the reasons why the DQP is, among the various other options that you mentioned, an option of choice, because it does intend to be reflective of the broader conversation and to contribute to that conversation in a unique way.
Natasha, do you have any thoughts about this area?
No, I think that provides a good summation. I think the value of a lot of this work isn't really quite understood by institutions until they really begin to engage with it and see kind of different potentials and opportunities for using this framework in a variety of different ways and really understand the flexibility that's inherent in it. So I think that's really the only point that I would add.
Thanks. So let's get into this aligning of associate degree level outcomes to the degree qualifications profile. And we'll start with some common questions or concerns about the DQP for alignment. And some of these you could predict, maybe all of them. One of them is, why should we do this again? We already have degree outcomes. And yes, we all have. But this alignment of our program level outcomes to the DQP lets us revisit and go deeper with the goal of enhancing the experience of students in our degree program and increasing the number of degree completers. in a way, these projects, the DQP projects at the colleges, allow us as higher education professionals and as learning organizations to really undertake our own applied learning and specialized learning and building our intellectual skills in the area of student learning outcomes and assessment, and developing a clear understanding of the competencies required of students in our degree program. There's also a question about what are we aligning exactly? Is it really the whole degree? And to that, we would say, yes, it's the whole degree. As with many bachelor's degrees, the associate degrees provide students with a grounding in types of learning that will be further explored in future studies, either on the job in career or in college. And in order to make the experiences coherent and cohesive, the alignment has to include the general education courses. And maybe the general education courses a particular discipline says identify best for students within our program of study, but there would not be a way of really getting there with this alignment and identification of outcomes and competencies without looking at the general education. So what is the intended audience of this work? And I would say, to begin with, the intended audience has to be the department whose degree is being aligned. The purpose has to be for enhancing what students attain with that credential in terms of learning and competencies. But of course, students and prospective students have to be included in our audience, and they need to be able to understand what we mean by the outcomes that they will achieve through their program of study. And then, of course, transfer institutions and employers all want to have a clearer feeling of what students get by achieving a particular degree. Let's also not forget funders. Funders are increasingly asserting their right to know this kind of information. And a big funder for many of us is that of the Student Financial Aid Program. So how do we think this is going to actually improve a student's experience? And we can talk about this a great deal. I hope you will at your colleges. But insofar as the effort is used to enhance learning and to communicate about it to the others that students need to have understand this, the students will be benefited by it. So the question then is there a quick how-to example? And we have developed such an example for our DQP projects. We're calling it the Degree Specification, which is a term that the folks who do tuning use. We might say, what are the degree specs? What are the specifications that go along with what is entitled a particular degree? In our project, the ACCJC's goal is not to come up with yet another system of forms and steps that everyone should buy into. Instead, your projects, the college's projects, are testing different ways in which the DQP can help deepen their SLO practice and communicate about it to others. However, every college has a part of it, as a part of its project, does have a goal of sharing the information. And one way this can happen is through development of a degree specification, a description of a degree that could accompany transcripts, that could be included in catalogs, and could really get at the learning part as well as, in conjunction with the traditional methods of listing of courses and so on. So we created a worksheet that can become information for a degree specification, even as programs are doing their DQP alignment. We have some elements in it. We kind of picture this in our minds as maybe a two-page kind of a document that would have, of course, the degree name, some perhaps a heading related to the institution itself, would talk about the philosophy or the purpose of the degree, and what were some of the very distinctive elements for people who would be completing that area of study, that program of study. I think importantly, it needs to talk about possible careers or the types of work or career that students are being prepared for. If there's anything about the educational style, the way in which the program is taught, that should be a part of what is communicated. And possible assessment methods. Are students building a portfolio? Do they have to engage in some kind of a large project? That would be of interest to people looking at the specification. And then at the guts of it, let's say, would be a larger section dealing with the core learning and the competencies. And this is where you put in the DQP aligned SLOs for the degree. So, okay, if we were going to do this, the question comes, what to do first? Do we map our current outcomes to DQP categories, or do we have a general discussion about competencies? And there's no right way to do this. But it is often helpful to think about the DQP categories of learning and outcomes first before mapping your existing competencies to the DQP. It helps generate an understanding of what are they getting at with this type of learning, and what are they trying to state in the DQP outcome statement, so that when you're doing the mapping, you really are able to then say, our outcome statement really does go into this category. And then the next follow-up, is it really capturing what the DQP had intended for the student's outcome in that kind of learning?
I would just add there that sometimes the answer is, no, we really don't have outcomes that correspond to this category in the DQP. And then the question becomes, should we, or is that something that we need to talk about? So the DQP has worked for some institutions, to use the current slang, as a tool in a kind of gap analysis. And some have discovered gaps, and that can be a useful point of departure for talking about curriculum and for talking about outcomes in general.
You know, if you think about traditional course articulation and how in the main you would expect a introduction to social class at this college should be similar to an introduction to social class at another college, and yet there will be pieces of that course in terms of content that are not the same, and that's the art and the craft of articulation work. One could imagine a DQP alignment related to student learning in the same way, where by using the same kind of a structure, colleges could look at the learning of a particular program at one college by comparison to learning in that category at another college. And it can be a very interesting way to put learning at the forefront. You know, you could ask, well, which category of learning should we start with in terms of our alignment? And again, of course, there's no set order, although, as a published document, there is an order just by virtue of having to put things down on paper for the DQP. But we found that the applied learning category is often a good one to start with. And that's because most programs have done work in recent years to include applied learning into their courses. And also, you can discuss this without having to immediately get into what does this outcome mean for particular types of content. We want to say, though, that a college should think about how to start their alignment work so that it would be most interesting and beneficial for their own participants. And then again, revisiting the same question in a different way, why is this approach better than the one we already have? And I think Paul would agree, we're not saying that the DQP is a better approach than yours or than other ones out there. But we do feel there's a benefit in using a profile that's taking hold across the country so that others who are intent on setting the value of a degree become aware of this work on a meaningful scale. And we want to have that ubiquitous look and feel to a description of learning so that the people in the public who want to know, employers, transfer institutions, get used to how to look at this material. We've talked again about how using a format can really sometimes hop and skip over what can really bog processes down, that beginning piece of what process should we use. And it lets people jump right in and say, let's just use this one. You know, if you want to say it's flawed, flaws and all, or if you say it's wonderful, all the great things about it, but we want to focus right in on our outcomes for students in our degree. No matter what, the degree work should build upon what you've been doing already. So now we're going to get into the specific areas of learning, and we want to do that so that we can talk about the kinds of questions that might be useful at your colleges and the kinds of questions that have come up. And in line of our thought that beginning with applied learning is helpful, at least it's been helpful for some other colleges, we have that first before us. And again, this is the learning where people bring experience from the outside into the classroom and have it connect with classroom material, as well as classroom material being brought to bear on external experiences. Let's look at the outcomes for this type of learning. The learning for students is application. Obviously, other content may be learned in the process. You have to be applying something. But this is a competency of a type of learning that the DQP feels is important. And, you know, it would be useful to think about how your program does this. How does it bring student experience into the classroom and help students take classroom work back out into the world? In order to deepen the applied learning, how has your department worked to build applications in one classroom that carry on to another? Let's say you have a student that takes this class and they have an applied learning exercise. They take another class in the program with another exercise. Do they connect? Are they reinforced in a way that helps the student know this is what they're getting from the program? And so also, how has the department worked with other disciplines represented in the degree to create the scaffolding that's necessary to really strengthen the applied learning skills of a student? Look at your program outcomes that deal with applied learning. Do they capture what you want for students in this area? Do they align with what the DQP is expressing? And then looking at your degree, how would you capture that applied learning in a degree description? How does the student know what they've gotten out of that applied learning experience? What do those competencies mean for a student? Paul and Natasha, what kinds of things have you gotten from the application area, this area of applied learning?
You mean the experience of those who've been using the DQP?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Go ahead, Natasha.
Oh, thanks. I think with the area of applied learning, it's an opportunity where institutions have brought together sort of opportunities to cross the academic affairs and student affairs divide. and have conversations that wouldn't have happened otherwise, potentially, is one of the areas that I've seen this as being very helpful and impactful. And I think to kind of backtrack outside of just specifically applied learning and talking about the alignment and the benefit of this, is what's really been heartening, I think, for us to see as we watch this work unfolding within institutions is the conversations that are happening and the faculty that might not have had an opportunity to really engage with one another or talk with each other and clarify different understandings and approaches and ways of thinking about this work with students. And it's really fascinating to see sort of the shift from talking about my course to our courses and really thinking about what are the experiences and opportunities I'm providing to students in my course, but who am I passing them to and where are they coming from and how do these connect in ways that maybe they haven't before. And so thinking about sort of the larger opportunities to make a more impactful educational experience for students just by having conversations about sort of what do we mean by applied learning, where does this happen, and where should it, have been really wonderful to see.
I agree and would add just a couple of additional examples. One institution has quite a robust commitment to international affairs, but in the light of the DQP, they realized that their study abroad programs were producing a lot in the way of rich experience, but not very much in the way of documented learning. And so they brought the DQP to bear on their international programs and are seeing, I think, a more substantive approach than before. Another very sophisticated institution sees research, student research, guided research, collaborative research as an expression of applied learning, and finding it there on a kind of continuum from classroom learning to work in the lab, to work in the field, but all reflecting the same level of intentionality and the same level of commitment to documented results. So you can take the concept of applied learning really as an expression of effective learning in general and apply it to any part of the curriculum, including some of the most resistant, namely my own, which is English language and literature. When you begin talking with English faculty about the implications of applied learning for what they do, you get a very interesting conversation, and I think it's exactly the right kind of conversation that we should be having and that the DQP can stimulate.
So let's look at civic learning and the learning that helps develop a readiness and acceptance of each student's obligation to contribute to their community. Here again, we have 3 outcomes that are proposed for associate degrees in the DQP, and colleges and programs might want to look at how civic learning relates directly to the degree they're working on. How does a student's own background and assumptions and predispositions impact their development in the degree program and afterwards in their performance in society? How does the program of study cause students to build competency in understanding historical and contemporary positions on democratic values? For example, government by the people or personal responsibility, those kinds of questions. And then what does achieving those kinds of competencies look like in the degree program? Do your existing outcome statements capture what is the essence of civic learning? And we have a question, and Paul, given your comment about the enhancement in this area in the DQP 2.0, the question we've received is, do all degrees really need to encompass civic learning?
I think the answer to the question would be, do all individuals who are awarded college degrees need to be citizens as well as as wage earners as well as participants otherwise. And I think most of us would say that the answer is yes. But civic learning is about more than being just a good citizen. Civic learning is about being an educated person in a society, understanding that there really aren't simple answers to many of the issues that confront the society. And one of the characteristics of an educated person is the ability to entertain contrary positions at a given time and to make sense of the dialogue that needs to occur between those positions. One of the concerns in contemporary society is that people tend to form their opinions and then find people to agree with them. And the educated individual is one who says, well, I believe I have an understanding of my opinion. Now let me try to understand the opinion of my neighbor and understand what the sources of both are and which may be the most appropriate. So that's the long answer to the question. The short answer is yes, I think all students, if we are to live in a society worth living in, all students need to embody the values that this category attempts to describe.
Natasha, have you seen any interesting work in civic learning with other colleges in other parts of the country?
Yeah, I think institutions that have engaged with civic learning sort of had a rougher start, I think, than the other areas, in part because of bringing people to the table that were sort of conceptualizing civic learning and a civic engagement kind of background and mindset, and so really trying to work through something that it was meaningful and specific for that institution, but kind of merging those two pieces together and seeing how civic engagement might fit under civic learning, or if it's some other kind of aspect. And so I think for us as tracking this work, some really interesting feedback opportunities arose from institutions that have focused on and thought about civic learning. But I would say across the board have really affirmed, as they've talked about it, the importance of this area, and have thought about ways that it's not, adding a course per se, but really integrating into existing curriculum opportunities and aspects, or making clearer and reinforcing where this was the intent that maybe students weren't quite picking up and getting that connection. And so just becoming more intentional in engaging with it. And those are really the areas I think that we've seen unfolding with institutions working with civic learning.
Thank you. In somewhat of a leap, let's say, to intellectual skills, we begin to look at more of the foundation of types of abilities that students need in terms of learning to get the most from the other kinds of learning in their pursuit of a degree. And again, these look much like the institutional learning outcomes that you will find at many of our member institutions. The DQP document itself talks about 5 intellectual skills that are connected with an associate degree. And what colleges might want to ask, well, what the degree faculty might want to ask is how the degree program itself ensures that these intellectual skills are learned. What is the role of the discipline courses as well as the general education courses in these areas? And again, in terms of sequencing, if a student is taking a class in the first semester with others who are taking it in the second or third semester, how does that class provide a first level of learning in the area of the particular intellectual skill, but also reinforce and heighten the level of learning for students who are taking this course as a second or third semester? And if you if you look at it, how do we understand these as general or broad kinds of learning capacities, as well as how individual disciplines look at them for their particular field? This is a challenge, but it can be really energizing for a program to understand how their mission includes these general intellectual skills. There's a question, though, and maybe, Paul, you might want to give this a stab. The question was, why is it useful to look at these skills and competencies as different types of learning? Looking back at civic learning, that included civic and cultural assumptions. Now we're looking at an intellectual skill that's talking about describing how cultural perspectives can affect problems in arts, politics, or global relations. What did the authors think about having what looked like similar subjects put into different types of learning?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of overlap in the DQP, and that's by intent, because these categories are not silos. They are permeable, and the repetition, I think, helps to make that point. But what intellectual skills, the treatment of intellectual skills, has in common with civic learning is that they both require in a sense, the educational process. They're not about becoming a better person. They're about becoming a better informed person and a more analytical person. And so if that is the value, then the category is less important. Going back to your earlier question, though, when you talked about how a particular course either introduces or builds on a particular skill, that I think if you're asking that question, you're already in a better place than many institutions are, because the problem that is most important is the one that you captured in your question, and that is the tendency in some institutions within some curricula to kind of consign part of the job to general education or to that course. So the student has had that course in writing. That means I don't need to worry about writing in my course. Or that student has had Algebra 2. That student has had pre-calculus or calculus. That means that I can ignore computational abilities in my course. And the premise of the DQP is really that it takes everybody, and that these skills that are introduced at one point need to be built upon, need to be used, need to be extended, or they'll atrophy. And one of the scandals of four-year institutions is that some students know more mathematics as sophomores than they do as seniors, because of that tendency to kind of sequester the curriculum. And the DQP talks about the necessary cooperation, partnership among everyone within the teaching faculty for the benefit of students.
Let's look at specialized knowledge, and this is an area where there have been questions about what is the role of the associate degree. Specialized knowledge involves acquiring the ability to look deeply in an area and to get a depth of learning, understanding what it takes to master an area. And one of the tasks within an associate degree, as with others, is for them to know the difference between learning for a general understanding and learning for mastery. Your conversations at the colleges might be about how is that done? How do students understand that difference? And how can your degree program teach students to delve in and learn something completely? How can they demonstrate mastering or conquering something of depth within a field of study? And for that matter, what knowledge in your associate degree program is suitable for mastery? how can someone understand associate degree level mastery in this particular degree from what might be a level of mastery at a bachelor's level of a similar degree? Or for those going into the working world directly, how will mastery of these entry level or starting point competencies look different from what one might have at the mid-career level? So, you know, the question I would like to ask Natasha, what have you seen in terms of interesting programs for people who have worked in the area of specialized knowledge? And then we have a question that you might want to attack, or maybe Paul, within a liberal arts degree, how do students attain the specialized knowledge to learn mastery? But let's start, Natasha, with interesting programs.
Sure. I think where we've seen specialized knowledge really making sense and taking hold within community colleges is with professional programs or technical degrees, actually. So like nursing is really easy to kind of wrap your mind around within a community college program because there's so many requirements and things that you have to do already that kind of present the program in a way that's easier aligned for this. But with some fascinating ones that I've seen unfolding is in sort of welding areas. And so thinking about the art and profession of welding and sort of what do you need to know that this piece is finished, or that the technique aligns in meaningful ways and it fits in with employers. And so it actually allowed for community colleges to engage with this to bring in their stakeholder groups that they're already talking to in these programs to make sure that the knowledge and skills are aligned in ways. So in North Dakota, there's actually an interesting example where they brought in not only employers, but community-based organizations and members of the communities to have a conversation about specialized knowledge and really think about the different areas in which this might touch on. And then not only that, but then how do you build? So how do you create sort of a degree program that allows for specialized knowledge at this point in time for students that's really all that they want or where they're headed, but sets them up if they want to continue in this area or to grow, or even in an area or a career that we haven't yet thought of as a field or has yet to exist. And so what are the ways of really thinking about that honing in and working on specialized knowledge in those ways, and that's where I think I've seen it most actualized in community colleges.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be very brief because I am keeping my eye on the time. I would simply say, with regard to your question about liberal education, is that any liberal education worth the name includes an awareness of specialized knowledges and an appreciation for them, and a commitment to study in depth.
Thank you. Well, let's go then to looking at broad integrative knowledge. And I'm looking here. I'm sorry, I've got a thing. All right. I'm trying to advance my screen, but I have got something I have to get rid of. But looking at broad integrative knowledge as the knowledge acquired in general education fields to attain breadth of learning, sort of the liberal education competencies, I would say I wouldn't contrast it with specialized knowledge, but it is the breadth concept as opposed to the depth concept of the previous area of learning. And these kinds of outcomes, if one were to look at them, look a lot like the outcomes associated with many degrees. Though the degrees cover many different disciplines, broad integrative knowledge types of outcomes tend to be what one sees. And so the questions might be, how does your institution explain the value of liberal education to its students? What communication is undertaken to explain the value of attaining an associate degree, even for students whose goals are to transfer? And how does this listing of broad, integrative knowledge competencies alter your thinking about the content you offer in your program of study, especially when looking at the other kinds of knowledge? If you were to focus only on the degree level outcomes across your curriculum, how might that alter a student's pathway through your program? Paul, any other thoughts about this type of learning from the author's point of view?
Sure. I think that this type of learning is one that assumes and builds on an awareness of disciplines. The way as the third bullet suggests, you have to have an awareness of disciplines and of the conversation between them in order to attain a sense of integration and breadth. So really no contradiction between disciplinary and learning in depth and the breadth that this category seeks.
Natasha, anything you've seen by way of interesting programs that folks might want to look at on the NALOA website, for example?
There are a few, I think. In the sake of time, I might just point people towards our DQP corner. If you go to the NALOA website, learningoutcomesassessment.org, and click on Degree Qualifications Profile, we have a section on DQP in practice. And that's where institutions are talking about their work and involvement with the DQP, and they share rubrics and maps and a variety of tools where they're working on this. And there are some good examples, I think, that might be informative in this area in the DQP in practice section.
Thank you. So, well, there are many ways in which the conversation and alignment of degree outcomes to the DQP can really give your programs insights for enhancing or improving the degrees. And having as a goal the better communication about that learning and competencies for students and others will keep your conversations real as you go about your project. We're really looking forward to hearing about ways in which you are working with the DQP, and we'll be reporting on that in the future. But we really are glad that you joined with us. And Paul and Natasha, I'm really happy to have had you aboard with this program as well.
Enjoyed it very much, and it's always a pleasure to work with a CJC and with NALOA.
And thank you so much for having us on. It's great.
Thank you. Well, our time has come to an end, so I sincerely hope that everyone has enjoyed this session and found it beneficial, especially in relation to their own projects and to informing you a little bit more about the DQP. On the next slide, we're going to be providing some URLs to link you to resources we've used for this program. You'll be able to access an archived version of the webinar along with posted answers to questions that we didn't have time to answer on air. And again, if you have any other questions or concerns or comments, please don't hesitate to call or email us for more information about the Degree Qualifications Profile Project. Our telephone number is 415-502-0234. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.